host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with the bumpy U.S.-China ties. The U.S. State Department approved another potential arms sales to Taiwan, the second in less than a week. The deal could reach more than $2.3 billion. Last week, the U.S. already announced a weapons deal worth about $1.8 billion U.S. dollars. The two deals followed an August sale of fighter jets from U.S. to Taiwan also. In response, China says it will impose sanctions on American firms involved, namely Lockheed Martin, Boeing's defense division, and Raytheon Technologies, as well as other U.S. entities involved. Beijing says the U.S. should respect its commitment to the One China principle. So what's behind the frequent U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, especially at a time when the U.S. presidential election is approaching? Is that a strategy by one of those campaigns? Let's meet our guests. For U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, we are joined by, in Shanghai, Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University. In Boston, Robert Ross, associate with the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies of Harvard University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for both of you joining us on this critical moment leading up to the U.S. presidential election. A lot of things are going on, including how the U.S. is trying to demonstrate its power leading up to that specific date. Mr. Ross, how much of what we are seeing right now has much to do with that election?
I think there are a number of things. One, I think that Donald Trump is getting quite worried about the election, so he's doing everything he can to signal that he's a strong diplomat, a strong leader resisting China. That's not going to be very effective. Most people do not vote on the basis of foreign policy, or even less on policy toward China, but he's getting quite desperate, I should say. But then second, I think this is part of a longer-term strategy that Donald Trump has pursued to try and constrain the rise of China. And he's using Taiwan simply as a tool, as an instrument, to put pressure on China, and perhaps even to provoke China. In this respect, I think the Chinese leadership has been quite wise to thus far wait until the outcome of the election and thus be patient to see whether or not we can have a new leader who will be less provocative. So I think it's both the election and Donald Trump's basic strategy toward China to try and constrain China's rise in any way he can.
China, however, is very cautious, but at the same time watching everything very closely. Professor Shen, China also condemned the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, this time twice, and also has been watching very closely the military exercise going on over there related to Diaoyu Island.
Okay, the Trump administration wants to play the Taiwan card in order to make mainland China excited. And he needs to use the Taiwan factor to help his campaign. And this is the 13th Trump government sale of weapons to Taiwan, and maybe the third in the recent months. And we are very much against it. At the same time, we know that Taiwan would take years to be able to use them. So this recent sale is merely a political sale to offend mainland. So mainland may do something. Maybe China, U.S. may have some military conflict. So President Trump may be viewed as a wartime president that may help his desperate effort to make him re-elected.
How cautious do you think, Professor Shen, China will be and should be leading up to November the 4th, or probably even after that, if nuance of elections goes on inside Washington and beyond?
As usual, we are against such a U.S. arms sale to Taiwan. In U.S. view and in Taiwan view, it's defensive. But in our view, because the U.S. recognized Taiwan as a part of China, such a kind of so-called defensive weapon sale to Taiwan is totally offensive. We take a defensive action. You are against us, and we have to take action that we don't do business with this company. So this is very defensive, not offensive. So we prefer not to do any business with Boeing Defense, with Raytheon, etc. That is our cautious action. We don't shoot in the first place, and we don't take offensive means, but we do deserve our right to take defensive measures.
Mr. Ross, your comment.
I agree with much of what Professor Shun has been saying, that China is reacting defensively, and it may well be true that Donald Trump would like to provoke China so as to create an incident that will make him a wartime president and create greater popularity for him. We should note he's doing the same thing against Iran, increasing the sanctions and threatening Iran, hoping that perhaps there's a crisis with Iran that would make him popular. But I think it's quite clear that it is not in China's interest to have an escalation of the U.S.-China conflict, and that China's patience in dealing with Donald Trump is really quite remarkable, how much provocative Donald Trump has been with a trade war, an ideological war, a technology war. But it is indeed in China's interest to wait, because if Donald Trump loses this election, we will have a new president. And I think this new president will want to cooperate with China much more in other areas and abandon Donald Trump's, what he calls, decoupling or all-of-government approach, because we have many interests that require cooperation. And so patience is the right strategy. And let's see what happens on November 3rd, November 4th.
Mr. Ross, on the other hand, we see the joint military exercise between the United States and Japan. Of course, one has seen that over the past decades. However, this time with quite a scale. And also this time, it's when the U.S., at least the Trump administration, is trying to build up what they call the Indo-Pacific, their new ally circle. And how should we understand the latest joint exercises and its timing, right before the 5th of November, it would wrap up?
I don't think we should be overly concerned about an exercise where we were planning to retake a worthless island in the East China Sea. If there is conflict, the islands become irrelevant. So this is clearly an effort to a show of force, to reassure Japan, to show the region that America remains a great power and that we will remain in Asia and balance and resist the rise of China. So if you will, these are shows of force, not really a manifestation of American interests or even American capabilities in dealing with China. But second, these exercises are long planned, many months in advance, even years in advance. So we shouldn't read too much into these exercises as designed to influence the outcome of the election. Now, regarding the Indo-Pacific strategy, you're absolutely right. This is part of the Indo-Pacific strategy to rebuild and strengthen our relationship with Japan, with India, with Australia. And in all these efforts, America has to reveal and show that it can be a helpful ally in dealing with the rise of China. But I think it's important to recognize that whether it's Japan or Australia or India, these are far from China, far from the South China Sea. And so to the extent that they are substitutes for America's relationships inside East Asia, they reflect America looking for new allies rather than trying to bolster our relationship with our traditional allies. 9,000
from U.S., 39,000 from Japan. That's what's likely to be participating in the joint military exercise near the Diaoyu Island. Mr. Shun, Professor, tell me more about your analysis. Both sides also have sent quite a number of helicopters as well as certain, shall I say, certain scale of weapons to be used over there. So how should we understand the scale of it and the significance of it now?
Well, as we say, one stone to create multiple purposes. The first purpose is to reinforce the traditional U.S.-Japan security partnership, to assure Japan, as my friend Professor Ross has mentioned, that Japan is secure. It's still here, unyielding security commitment. Second purpose is to assure another American friend, maybe not a country, but at least a partner, which is Taiwan. Don't worry, despite People's Liberation Army's and its Navy's recent multiple exercises in the region, America stands by Taiwan. Don't worry about some surprise things to happen on the day of the U.S. election. And the U.S. military is next to you, and we are going to deter any possible threat to my friend. The third stone is to serve as a strong signal to deter the mainland China. We watch your naval exercise, and Air Force recent patrol in the area close to Taiwan. Don't do more. If you do more, probably the U.S. will take some action. So this is a heightened, a more lifted security deterrent against the mainland.
Therefore, Professor Shen, is China worried?
All this is to show the U.S. is the dominant leader. No challenge to this American role. And the major challenges, obviously, Beijing, in Americans' view, which U.S. want to send a signal, don't take the advantage of Americans' election. No chance.
We have seen also from China a very strong campaign to go back in history and to learn from history. Mr. Ross, for example, about the Korean War in the U.S. sense, but certainly to Chinese, it's 4 months after the Korean War broke out. It's in October 2050. China's war against U.S. aggression and aid Korea began. Was the 70th anniversary. The Chinese president talked about it. There were enormous amount of literature and movies coming out, and also veterans talking about their stories, oral history. This is an interesting time, certainly, but history should be remembered. Mr. Ross, remember at that time China was forced to go to a war at a time when it was thinking only to build its economy at the very early stage of the People's Republic. But with the U.S. Interfering in Chinese eyes onto the Korean Peninsula, which is in China's direct neighborhood, and the U.S. fleets, the 7th Fleet coming into the Taiwan Strait, which is threatening China's sovereignty, China started to make that decision. So, Mr. Ross, 70 years later, it's not necessarily about that war, but lessons to be learned about miscalculation and misjudgment on all sides.
Well, I think that President Xi's speech on the 70th anniversary made clear that China is quite worried about the trend in American policy toward Taiwan, and that it could lead to force China's hand to respond in ways that America would not like. And I think also Wang Huning's opinion piece in Renmin Ribao was quite clear that there are Chinese red lines. So, and just as there were during the Korean War. And China's watching closely America's relationship with Taiwan, the transits to the Taiwan Strait of the American Navy, the senior visits to Taiwan by American officials, and the arms sales to Taiwan, with great concern that it could encourage the leadership in Taiwan to be more bold and more risk-taking in challenging mainland interests. And the mainland's always been concerned that if the trend were to continue, it could lead to a crisis. Of course, this was the situation in 1996, when American policy suggested to the mainland that America was showing no restraint in support for Taiwan, and this could cross a mainland red line, leading to not just a crisis, but something worse. So President Xi's speech and Wang Huning's opinion piece were all warnings to the United States that you need to think twice about your relationship with Taiwan, what kind of weapons you sell, your leadership visits, and perhaps you're encouraging the Taiwan leadership to do things that are neither in U.S. interest or Chinese interest. And that American restraint and Taiwan restraint may be in American interest and in Chinese interest. We're reaching a very sensitive time in U.S.-Taiwan relations, and I think the mainland understandably wants to advise the United States to exercise caution. Now again, the mainland has been, I would suggest, fairly patient. It is clearly warning Taiwan with its military maneuvers, its flights, its ship movements, that Taiwan is taking great risk. Having said that, the mainland has been fairly patient, and so much will depend on the outcome of the U.S. election. We want to think about the future trend in the cross-Strait relationship and American involvement with Taiwan.
Professor Shen, there have been suspicion whether even leading up to the U.S. election with the one of the candidates trying to play the China card hard, and his apparatus trying to work the policy toward that direction with some of those who have been already pretty much against China over the past decades, working the policies in. This is going to be a very worrying infrastructure they are building in terms of U.S.-China policy. What do you make of that, Mr. Shen, particularly now when we're talking about joint naval exercise and arms sales and things related to Taiwan and also to China's relation with its neighboring countries? Professor Shen.
We don't want to have crisis. We want to prevent the crisis. And we want to communicate well with other stakeholders. Let's work together to jointly prevent a crisis. Let's look at the history. As Bob has mentioned, China-US were involved in a crisis 70 years ago. That's very unfortunate. The US was hurt by America's participation. And China is unhappy with such a happening, and China has also incurred of its own casualty. How to take the dear lesson as our asset to prevent a future which may be a different crisis. And we see the U.S. is not remembering the lesson. And America sent its secretary to Taiwan, according to Taiwan's certain statehood. America sent its highest serving diplomat to Taiwan since 1979, which is absolutely sent a wrong signal. This is not a good channeling of communication. This is a willed, intentional misleading of Taiwan toward a dangerous path. As a result, the Taiwanese top leader stated Taiwan is going to make a decisive measure or a determining step. And Taiwan's top representative to Taiwan, who is not a diplomat, not an ambassador, because Taiwan does not deserve a statehood. But this lady called herself as ambassador, which was not stopped by the U.S. government. It's unbelievable. That means Taiwan has already taken the opportunity, which it may have mistakenly from the U.S. signal. And the U.S. has mistakenly pushed Taiwan toward a dangerous path. This kind of dangerous interaction would only make a mainland to be correctly understand they are going to make a change. De jure change that may inevitably trigger one of the three triggers of mainland China's anti-secession law, which means we are going to use unpeaceful means to deal with the crisis. We send the message by having our military exercise, by sending our political message. That stopped Taiwan, and their so-called foreign minister stated they are not going to restore official diplomatic relationship with America. This is right. You should never try to do this. But this is possibly pushed by Trump government. They may not want to do, but what they have done has mistakenly pushed Taiwan to think all this may be possible.
I agree with what Professor Shun is saying, is that unlike in the past where we had American leaders who had a long relationship with Taiwan, we had friends on Taiwan, we had historical cooperation, the Trump administration doesn't really care about Taiwan. They're not doing this to protect Taiwan, they're not doing this to advance Taiwan interests, they're doing this as an instrument to put pressure on the mainland. And so this could end up being the worst possible outcome for Taiwan. Should the mainland find that red lines are crossed, trend is getting dangerous. And the administration is acting somewhat recklessly for the interests of Taiwan, simply to enhance its strength, its signaling regarding the rise of China and America as a great power. It's a fairly reckless policy. I would add that unnecessary. It's not necessary to defend Taiwan's interests. It's not necessary to deter. It's not necessary to reassure Taiwan. This is simply efforts, part of a larger American effort, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's with Taiwan, whether it's our naval operations with Japan. This is all part of a larger policy of signaling the world, signaling Asia, and America is still a great power.
Yeah.
And in some respects, it shows America's great concern, even insecurity, at the rise of China and the pace, the speed at which China is closing the gap in U.S.-China capabilities and the implications for America's strategic partnerships in East Asia.
Finally, before we go, both of you gentlemen, would you like to shed some light about how we should be able to proceed the rest of the days leading up to the U.S. election, as this is one of the most sensitive time of this year, certainly to say the least. Professor Shun, please.
I want to caution American current government. Don't create any surprise for the last less than 1 week leading to the election. And China would not be surprised for whatever U.S. want to create a surprise. We are ready. We are on high alert. We are very cautious. We are very responsible in dealing with all kinds of scenarios. And we would not be surprised, but it's better for U.S. government not to generate any surprise.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ross, please.
We can avoid an unnecessary crisis, unnecessary escalation, unnecessary tension. We can gradually move to a more constructive relationship. So there the issue is patience, not allow Donald Trump to provoke, and wait for a future opportunity to try and restore cooperation in many important areas of common interest.
Thank you also. Robert Ross, Shending Li, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and be well, be safe.